You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
This is the Great Iron Maiden Discussion Part 2. Many of you guys, I'm sure, heard Part 1 of the podcast, which was the last Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast posted. This continues on where Part 1 left off at Peace of Mind, and believe it or not, we still didn't make it through the entire Iron Maiden catalog. Of course, the guests, Brian Slagel and Malcolm Dome, the same guests we had on the first part of the Maiden discussion, continue on here, and Malcolm, being the busy man that he is, he's only able to spare an hour because we got to call him at like 6 in the morning since he's got that 8-hour difference. So it looks like we're going to be doing a Part 3 episode sometime in the near future. I think this Part 2 takes us right into the Blaze Bayley years, and so the Part 3 will finish it off from Bruce Dickinson's return with the Brave New World onwards. So once again, starting from the Peace of Mind record, of course, Malcolm Dome, we gave him a proper introduction on this episode, and Brian Slagel from Metal Blade Records. So without further ado, let's do it. This is the Shockwave Skull Sessions, heard exclusively on roadrunnerrecords.com/skull sessions. Actually, before I get into it, I noticed on the first part, I didn't introduce Malcolm. I was so rude of me. I did not introduce Malcolm to the podcast. I know we've had Brian on before, but people who are not familiar with Malcolm Dome, those of you living under a rock, why don't you talk about what you're doing there, Malcolm?
Good grief. These days involved with Total Rock Radio, writing for magazines like Classic Rock and Metal Hammer, and Classic Rock Presents Prog, and a magazine called Rocks in Germany, doing occasional bits on DVDs, etc. Apart from that, not a lot.
And, Brian, what new stuff you got going on at Metal Blade?
Oh, God, there's 4 billion things going on. Just go to metalblade.com. They'll tell you everything. But we have Charred Walls of the Damned coming out February 2nd, which is Richard Christie, used to be in Iced Earth, and Jim Ripper Owens on vocals, and Jason Sukoff, who's the producer of Trivium and Job for Cowboy, and a million other things, Black Dahlia Murder. So it's a little kind of mini supergroup thing. Came out really cool. I like it. And then we're working on new Whitechapel album and a new As I Lie Dying album. Both of those will be out in late spring, early summer, and there's 10,000 other things to go check out. So.
All right. So we left off at the Number of the Beast, of course, the Great Iron Maiden Discussion. So we'll continue on and go ahead. We'll try to go through this as quick as possible. Let's start out with a Peace of Mind. How about we start with you on that one, Malcolm?
Peace of Mind, obviously, it was a birth, I suppose, of what people will probably know as the classic Iron Maiden lineup, with Nick and McBrain coming into the band for Clive Burr. And it was really a continuation for me of what they did a Number of the Beast, except it had a little bit more confidence about expanding on the progressive nature of Maiden's music. And in retrospect, of course, Maiden really have always been a progressive metal band, and Steve Harris's inclinations have always led in that direction. And you can certainly hear and feel that on Peace of Mind. It's a very impressive piece of work as a self-contained unit rather than a collection of great tracks.
Yeah, I think, the biggest significant change, of course, is Nico coming in, which it's kind of interesting because, first of all, I think Peace of Mind is a brilliant album, and of course, there's legendary tracks on there, The Trooper and Die With Your Boots On and, Revelations. But it's interesting because, I was a huge Clive Burr fan, and this is, kind of we talked about in Part 1 about how, the change of vocalists when Bruce came in and Paul Di'Anno left. And I think that there was not a significant change, but certainly definitely a bit of a different style when Nico came in as opposed to what Clive was doing. And I was always a big Clive fan. It took me, I love the record, thought it was amazing, but it did take me a little bit to get used to Nico's drumming. Because it's interesting because, he was in that band Trust before this. It was a great French heavy metal band. And he didn't really, you listen to those Trust records, while they're phenomenal records, he wasn't really kind of the, busy, a lot of stuff going on type of drummer. And clearly, on this record he came in. And obviously the signature track drumming-wise is The Trooper, which is a brilliant drumming song. But it did take me as a fan back then just a moment to kind of readjust, it's a little bit different. But obviously it worked out well. It's a phenomenal record. And, probably the one track on there that I think is the one that doesn't ever get a lot of publicity that I think is absolutely phenomenal is The Taint of Land, which I absolutely love. I'd love to see them play that live. I always bug Smallwood. Never think we'll see that one again, but I don't know. There's so many other great tracks they don't play either.
Yeah, I agree with you actually about when Nico came into the band, because I was a big Clive Burr fan too. And no disrespect for Nico, I love his drumming, but it definitely was a change. And by the way, Nico also did the first, I think 2 or 3 Pat Travers records as well.
And there was also the band called the Streetwalkers before then, who had a little bit more of the progressive leanings from the 70s in the UK. So he'd been around for quite a time before he got his big break, as it were, with Maiden.
Wow, I was unaware of that, but yeah, I do see what you're saying there, Brian, because I was obviously, as everyone was, a big fan of Clive Burr's drumming, so it was a little bit of a change. The opening track I loved, Where Eagles Dare, and I do love his drumming on that, and I just think that's just a ass kicker of a tune. I remember when I first heard that record, it came out in '83, and I got it right as it came out. And I remember being pretty disappointed because I wasn't used to the real progressiveness that Maiden was turning into. I love Number of the Beast, and a lot of people were digging Peace of Mind, and I remember in Headbanger, I think I wrote a pretty bad review on it too, because it just to me it just wasn't Maiden. They were just going into this very progressive style. Although I did love To Tame a Land, I've always loved epics, and I saw that was a real start of seeing a lot of classic Maiden epics. Although Hallowed Be Thy Name, I think, is one of the biggest epics, which was on the previous record. But and I thought the Sun and Steel had a lot of that Samson kind of flair. If you had the chorus and everything sounded, kind of reminded me of Samson. And of course, I love The Trooper. And, Flight of Icarus was kind of the big song at the time before The Trooper. I remember that was the first single, and I didn't care for that one or Revelations that much, but the album's definitely grown on me. And now it is.
You didn't like Revelations? Oh,
no, I didn't care for it. I just thought it was just kind of a boring song. And Die With Your Boots On, I didn't like the title of that. I thought the chorus was kind of lame on that at the time. Although I will say the album has since grown on me, absolutely. But, my first impression was kind of disappointment because I was a big fan of Number of the Beast, and I just didn't think this one lived up to it.
To live up to Number of the Beast would have been very difficult. It was such a monstrous record and such an all-encompassing album. I don't believe they could have actually lived up to that. So they did the only thing they could do, went in a different direction.
Which I think, looking back on it, is wise now. It's good. It's a good thing they didn't repeat themselves. Like I said, now listening back, it is one of my most listened to Maiden records, I would say.
The interesting thing that I felt about this record was it took a long time to digest. And maybe that's why, Bob, I don't know when you wrote your review, Bob, but I imagine after only a couple of listens, because it took a long, there's so much going on in that record because it was, at that time, super progressive. I remember when it came out, I liked it at first, but I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it. But I listened to it over and over and over again, and really, the more I listened to it, the more I really liked it. It probably took a couple of weeks for me to really get into it. And then once I had kind of, digested everything and really kind of figured it out, then I absolutely loved it.
Right. Well, that's something I've always been guilty of as a journalist. And I'm sure that both of you, being journalists, particularly back in the early 80s, Brian, with your fanzine, you would write something right away when something came out. And being a young writer, you would just be very opinionated on your thoughts of it. And then looking back, you go, God, man, the album really isn't that bad because you didn't give it a chance to grow on you. And so many of these metal records, particularly bands like Iron Maiden, really, you got to listen to it a few times and really let it grow on you before you could really digest it.
I think it's the nature of the beast. Sometimes you get very short periods of time in which to review an album, and you have an opinion straight away because you have to have one. And then subsequently you realize, actually, there's so much more to the record than you first gave it credence for. And it's also something, and it's not part of this discussion, but in general, when record labels decided, we're not going to send records out, you have to come into our office and listen to it once, well, it's doing no service at all to the artist or the album. And Maiden are a band who have complexity and depth, and you do need to live with a record, especially Peace of Mind or something like that, to get what it's about.
Absolutely. Should we move on to Power Slave?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Sure.
1984 Power Slave. And I will note, this is when bands were putting out, or, big bands like Maiden were still putting out records every year, continuously, new studio records. So to consider that they're able to, write such classic material every year is, pretty amazing. I mean, nowadays, the span of a Maiden record is once every 3 to 5 years or something.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. So let's get
You can only fit about 40 some odd minutes on vinyl anyway, so they're shorter.
That's true. All right, who wants to start out Power Slave?
Well, I think for me, Power Slave, again, was a striking example of the way that Maiden can marry up the more, shall we say, commercial end, Aces High, for instance, with the epic, in-depth analyses and the fascination with history that Power Slave itself had. And, of course, it immediately brings up the great artwork. And that's maybe the first thing that comes into most people's mind when you mention a Maiden album is the sleeve of that particular record, because they were self-contained, so striking. And what's Eddie going to be doing now? And, of course, we did have
I agree.
The Egyptian approach and theme on the stage set, and certainly on the record and on the sleeve, made it stand out again. And that's what the beauty of Maiden at that point in their career. They seemed to make the right moves at the right time. And sadly, when we went into the 90s, they lost their way a little bit. But certainly at that point, every move they made was a winner.
Absolutely. What about you, Brian?
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree about the artwork. I think, that was the best artwork I thought they had since Killers. Because I liked the other two, but this one was like, whoa, this is really incredibly detailed, a really interesting take on things too, with the whole Egyptian thing going on. And the record itself, is pretty classic, obviously. There's a couple of... It was kind of the first Maiden record, though, where there was a song or two that I was a little questionable on, like, Lost for Words and Back in the Village, where I was kind of like, I like them, but, not as much as some of the other stuff. But, all of that doesn't really matter because you have the combination of Power Slave and the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And at that point... a metal band doing a 13-minute long song that is as amazing as that is was truly, revolutionary, really, in my opinion. I mean, people have done long songs, Jethro Tull before them, and maybe that's where they got the influence from. But, to do something that long and that progressive and have these, peaks and valleys and the middle part of it, I mean, that song to me was just like, wow, this is really, really, they definitely stepped up their game big time. I also felt that Nico felt more comfortable on that record, more as great as he was on Peace of Mind. He felt like, okay, he's in the band, he's toured with them. I think he gets exactly what they're doing now, and he kind of has had his own take more on that record as well. I think the drumming was much better and much more together with the band, maybe on that record. But again, probably the pinnacle, one of the many pinnacles of the band's career. Certainly, they were getting monstrously huge at that point.
Absolutely. And the production. Let's not forget the production, which again was crisp, clean, did the job, and it actually sort of made clear, even something like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner wasn't over fussy.
Yeah. Martin
Birch
just amazing.
Amazing. Yeah. Absolutely. Martin Birch is a producer who allowed Maiden to progress in the way that they wanted to, but also enhanced what they wanted to do. So he was the ideal producer for Maiden. He never dominated them or dictated. He took what they wanted to do and made it happen.
Absolutely. I'm glad you bring up Martin Birch because a lot of people don't realize that. I definitely think he was very influential, particularly in Maiden's early career and with the Power Slave record in general. Absolutely.
Well, he produced most of my all-time favorite records between the Maiden and Rainbow and Deep Purple, Blue Oyster Cult. I mean, the guy was a genius.
Absolutely. And much Mrs. Sad is no longer producing, but he's left behind a huge legacy, and what he did with Maiden is certainly has stood the test of time. We're talking about 1984, 26 years ago. Remarkable, and it still sounds fresh today.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually love the record. It's one of my favorite Iron Maiden records. And again, when I first heard it, I thought it kind of struck me very progressive. But my a partner with Headbanger fanzine, Fid, was a huge fan of the whole, he was really into the whole concept and the lyrics and everything, and he just kept pushing it on me, and I kept listening to it, and I just fell in love with it. I mean, it is one of those albums that takes a while to digest, but I agree with you, from the concept, the Egyptian concept and the artwork and the lyrics and the music, it was really brilliant. It was a brilliant album. Power Slave, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, two absolute epics. And, the first two songs, Aces High and 2 Minutes to Midnight, which I didn't like in the beginning, but now I love that song. And, I wasn't crazy like Brian about Back in the Village and, Lost for Words. But, all in all, it was, for 8 songs, it was a pretty amazing record.
Oh, absolutely. Because they did with Back in the Village and The Prisoner what they'd already done with 22 Acacia Avenue and Charlotte the Harlot, almost revisiting a theme. Quite why they decided to do it at that point, I'm not too sure. But it is interesting the way that they sort of, especially now, it's become topical because The Prisoner is back on our screens, or will be soon. And there were Maiden, back in the 80s, when The Prisoner had gone out of fashion in a way, showing an interest in Steve Harris's fascination for what he's into, and his ability and determination to say, I'm going to write about it, even if you don't care. And I'm going to make you care.
That's absolutely right. That's something I was going to get into later on. And that what is something I've always admired about Steve Harris in particular. He's just, in a way, a stubborn prick, but in a good way. I mean, he'll do what he wants to do, and he'll jam it down your throat. I mean, when Maiden plays live, they'll do the whole record. Whether you want to hear it or not, they'll make you hear it and make you love it, and they'll still sell out. And,
absolutely.
They're one of the few bands that could still consistently get away with that today. It pisses me off sometimes that he's so stubborn about that, but in a way, you got to respect it, you know?
His greatest strength is his biggest weakness in that stuff, most definitely. And at some point, as we'll find out in the 90s, it was a weakness, but it's also the strength that brought them back.
Absolutely. And also, one of my favorite Iron Maiden song titles of all time is on this Power Slave as well. Flash of the Blade.
Yes.
Hey, that's where Metal Blade comes into play, huh?
Well, we were already happening by then, so maybe they were influenced by that.
I'm sure they were. Yeah, cool.
Hey, I guess we can't finish up the Power Slave talk without talking about the tour.
Oh yeah.
Because that was kind of, and obviously it leads into the next record, of course, too. But the tour was one of the bigger undertakings in back then. For metal, I mean, they did, of course, the famous, string of shows at Long Beach with the gigantic stage show, and then, obviously the whole tour. And I was lucky enough; I went to all 4 of the Long Beach shows. The whole setup and everything with the stage and the Egyptian themes and everything were amazing. But Malcolm, you may remember this. I was actually also lucky enough to be in London when they were doing the shows at Hammersmith when they were recording those. And the same week, this is like one of the greatest weeks of my metal life, Dio was playing the same week at Hammersmith with Queensryche opening before The Warning came out. And what I found very interesting was that Dio, played, and he had an Egyptian stage setup on stage. And 4 or 5 days later, Iron Maiden had an Egyptian stage setup.
Right.
I thought I was like, wow, did they just keep the same stage for both of these bands?
It's amazing. Great ideas come around about the same time. Purely coincidental, of course.
I asked Ronnie once about that, too, and I said, I have to tell you the story about when I was in London in 1984, 85, I can't remember what it was.
84, I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was 84. I said, you played Hammersmith and Iron Maiden played Hammersmith. You both had the same stage setup. He laughed. He said, yeah, we didn't know anything about it, and then we heard afterwards that, they were doing the same stage setup. But Ronnie was funny. He also said that he hated playing Hammersmith because he thought it was an old, crusty, horrible venue, and he hated playing it. I was like, wow, that's too bad because it's such a great venue. I was like, wow, that's really bizarre.
Hammersmith is just iconic, and you look at it in certain ways, like the Marquee or CBGB's, and the old, crusty, rundown CD, but it's part of its charm.
Those are the best places. I hate these new venues that are like fucking Disneyland set up.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, the atmosphere and the vibe in something like Hammersmith is incomparable. Yeah, the new venues just too antiseptic. They're not they're designed rather than built.
But Hammersmith is also really small. Like I always thought, growing up here, they're playing at Long Beach Arena, 16,000 people. I always thought Hammersmith was 10 or 12,000 people. It's like, what, 4 or something?
Yeah, 3,000. Well, it used to be with seating just over 3,000. Now with seats out, it's closer to 5. But even so,
when did they take the seats out, Malcolm? Did they?
A few years ago.
Oh, just recently. Oh, okay.
Yeah, not too long. They sometimes put them back in for certain shows, like when Yes, for instance, play there, because that is a sort of show where people like to sit.
Yeah.
But when you got a Maiden playing, of course, everyone wants to stand.
You mean those Maiden shows there? They were all with seats, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. All those shows back there with seats. Nobody was sitting in the seats. They're all standing. Yeah. But I was like 8th row from the stage, right in the center. That was one of the greatest shows I'd ever seen. Just being at that venue and having that sight line was just unreal. It's almost like you're watching your own private Iron Maiden show.
Especially after something like Long Beach, absolutely.
Was Long Beach before the London show, Brian?
Yeah, Long Beach was before, yeah.
Okay. Well, since we are touching on the Long Beach show, of course, I don't want to get into, obviously, all the live albums, the 20,000 live albums they put out.
Yeah, I know, too many.
This is pretty much a quintessential live album, the Live After Death. And since we're talking about the tour, and that was at the Long Beach Arena, most of it was recorded there. And, of course, Bruce Dickinson's famous line, "Scream for me, Long Beach."
Yeah.
But what were your thoughts of that album being compared to other classic metal albums such as the Made in Japans and those? Did you feel it ranked right up there with it?
Definitely, absolutely. It captured the imagination at the time, the energy, the power. It certainly was a live album done for the right reason, not because let's just record a tour and throw it out there because we can. It really encapsulated Maiden at a peak. Not the peak, maybe, but a peak. And for me, it's up there with Strangers in the Night, Live and Dangerous, Unleashed in the Studio, Unleashed in the East. All those live albums which mean something. And that certainly is a live album that means something. Everything, the cover, the lot, has a certain vibe and ambience about it, and you can't argue with the track listing. Superb.
Oh, excellent. I was kind of disappointed in parts. I think this was toward the end of the tour in the U.S. when they did Long Beach. Bruce's voice, he seems a bit tired in places, but apart from that, I think it's definitely the definitive live Maiden record as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, I don't think anything's come close.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, none of those things they put out afterwards are anywhere near what this was. I mean, like Malcolm said, it really just captured the band right at their, music playing and writing and everything height at that point. And to capture a moment in time like that, so everyone's releasing live albums, and at that point it just became kind of passé to do it. But they really were capturing a phenomenal moment in time for that band. And being at the shows and seeing it, I've been at other shows that have been recorded, like, for example, when they did Kiss Alive 2, I went to those shows, and half of the songs on Kiss Alive 2, they didn't even play live. So,
right.
Being at the shows, and you could really feel that there were minimal, if any, overdubs on those. It really felt like a live record, and you got the feeling, the energy, the power of what they were like live. Because at that point, they were just destroying people. I think I saw 18 shows on that tour around the world, and I could have done more if I could have afforded it at that time. That was a phenomenal tour, and to have a keepsake like Live After Death there was really amazing.
And the great thing is, for people that haven't had the chance to see Maiden live at the time, it truly represented. I mean, you can't forget about the great raps that Bruce Dickinson had in between songs like Running Free. You could just feel him, captivating the audience.
Oh, yeah.
And it is a brilliant live record, no question about it.
Yeah,
they're definitely one of the best Maiden.
Came with it was great.
Well, one of the best Maiden albums, let alone live or whatever. It's far and away the best live album, but a great Maiden album. Great representation of the first 4 or 5 years of their career, really.
Absolutely.
The video that came with it was awesome, too, except for some of their choices in stage clothes on that tour were a little questionable, but Dave Murray especially.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's never been sartorially elegant, has he? He's always had a little bit of the clown about him. But there you go.
Court jester.
Yes.
Let's move on to, I guess, Somewhere in Time, 1986. You want to start that one out, Malcolm?
That's a patchy album for me. For me, that was the beginning of Maiden being a little inconsistent. I don't think it's a great record even now. I think it's got its strong moments, but overall it somehow left me a little cold, and still does. I don't know what Brown feels about it.
Well, I actually really liked that record a lot. I remember when it came out, there was a lot of people who felt like Malcolm did that were very questionable on it. And the one thing that I didn't particularly like a lot was I thought the production was weird, because this is when they were kind of going under that strange sort of guitar tone where they were using I forget the name of it, that thing that I think Tom Scholz invented that kind of gave you this
Rockman.
The Rockman
guitar tone, and of course. Yeah, the Rockman, exactly. They were using that to record the guitars, and you had the the keyboards kind of come in, but But I do love that record, though. I mean, there's some songs on there, to me, that rank up with some of the greatest Maiden songs. Like, the first song, Caught Somewhere in Time, is phenomenal. Loneliness and Long Distance Run, I think, is a really good song. Stranger Strange Land is great. One of my all-time favorite Iron Maiden songs is Deja Vu. I don't know why, but I love that song. That's one of those songs that'll go in my head for like weeks on end, and I'll have to listen to it. And Alexander the Great also, I think, is one of their epic songs, which gets really lost in the shuffle behind, Hallowed Be Thy Name and Brian Slagel, Mariner, as it should be, because it's not as good as those. But that song almost was more, because of the, what Bruce had to do vocally and the story they're telling and how the music was doing, is almost so progressive and so out there that I thought was really great. So I do think there's some unbelievable tracks on there that do match up to what they were doing beforehand. Unlike some other people, like even Malcolm is like, I'm not really sure about that record. But I actually love the whole record. Even Wasted Years and Sea of Madness, which maybe and Heaven Can Wait, and Heaven Can Wait and Wasted Years are big live songs, and by this point I'm still kind of burnt on hearing them. I'm not as into them as I used to be, but I do really like that record. I go through bouts actually where I don't know 5 or 6 years ago I hadn't listened to the Maiden records for a while. And for some reason, I just popped it into my CD player and started listening to it. I think I listened to it for like a month straight. I got so really into that record again.
I don't know. I mean, Stranger and Strange I love, and Heaven Can Wait, and Wasted Years. But Alexander the Great's always been meandering for me.
Yeah,
it never quite captured something the way they had done with Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, for instance. But I'm not saying it's a bad album, because it certainly is not. But I think also you're right about the guitar tones and use of keyboards, and so it was just maybe experimenting and not getting it totally right, from my point of view anyway. But it's still not an awful album at all.
One thing about that record, too, is I think vocally that might have been one of Bruce's better records. When you listen to, his vocal performances on some of those songs, like Somewhere in Time, and like I said, Alexander the Great, even like how catchy Deja Vu is, and there's a lot of really phenomenal vocal stuff going on there. And I felt really that, some of the earlier records were definitely, you could feel it was Steve Harris saying, okay, this is how this should go, and it was classic stuff. But I thought Bruce was really, really strong on this record quite a bit. And maybe that's because of the guitar tone was a little bit different. I don't know.
I actually agree with both of you on. I could see where it's got a bit of that coldness, which Malcolm describes. A lot of people say the production's very sterile on it. But when you hear especially the first two songs, Caught Somewhere in Time and Wasted Years, you crank those up. They just sound unbelievably clean, but just heavy as fuck. Caught Somewhere in Time, the bass, everything is just so crystal clear in it, and it's I actually love the production. I love the record. The one thing I do agree about Alexander the Great, epic, I don't know. I don't put it in the same ballpark as, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner or Hallowed Be Thy Name. I think it was kind of a poor attempt. Heaven Can Wait, everyone loves that song, and of course the band love it. They play it live all the time.
Yes,
that song annoys the hell out of me. I don't know why. It's just the chorus, Heaven Can Wait, and the way he sings that just is so annoying to me. And Stranger in the Strange Land, I love the song, but it's just so drawn out. It's just very repetitive. But the first two songs, I love Wasted Years. I thought that was just a great song.
That's a very good single. Yeah,
very good single,
track.
Very catchy, great video, and it's just a real honest, metal song to me. And, Sea of Madness was good. It had some good songs. Definitely not one of their best albums. But, I remember at the time it came out, and even now, it's been pretty consistent as far as, my likings. And I still listen to it quite a bit, actually.
Fair enough. It's all about opinion.
But, there's definitely people on both sides of that camp. Like, I do like that record a lot, a big proponent of it. But there were a lot of people. Look, if you take it and put it up against Power Slave or World Slavery Tour, the live album, or Peace of Mind, Numbers of Beast, it's not going to match up with those. But it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like Metallica, where everybody bases like every Metallica record should sound like Master of Puppets, and when it's something that they're different, people tend to not be into it. But I get that too. It's like it's not as good a record, and for me being maybe such an uber fan, I was like, I love all of it, but I do love Alexander the Great. So Anyway.
And Adrian Smith writes, I believe, I'm actually cheating, I'm looking on the internet here, A Stranger in the Strange Land, Sea of Madness, and Wasted Years were all three written entirely by Adrian Smith, which is kind of unusual.
I didn't realize he wrote Stranger in a Strange Land on his own. I knew he did Wasted Years as
and
his
usually
song.
it's either him or Bruce or him and Steve that write together, but he solely wrote those three songs, which you can see they're giving him a lot more writing credit.
You guys ran out of ideas.
That's also possible.
That could be. Well, shall we move on to 1988, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son?
Yeah.
You want to
one of the best Maiden albums. I think it's one of the very best things they've ever done. I mean, it's great that they did a conceptual album because they've been building to it. But I think everything about that record works. Lyrically, musically, the way it's put together. And The Evil That Men Do, Only the Good Die Young, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. Those are great songs. And I think as a package and as individual tracks, it really worked brilliantly.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a great record. That's another record where people started to kind of go, I'm not sure if I like it or not, but I do love that record a lot. I think every song is very, very strong, and artwork, and I think that the concept thing was really cool that they finally got down to doing a whole concept record. Production from it, again, as much as I like it, it's very similar to that Somewhere in Time where they have that kind of weird guitar tone. There's a lot of keyboards in it. But I do really like that record. But I was kind of bummed out because, when they did this whole, the big tour they did, whatever, a year and a half ago, and they played a couple of those songs, and people, you could definitely tell the crowd was like, I'm not really into this stuff. So it kind of bummed me out because I love that they played those songs.
It's funny you say that because I agree with both of you. I thought this was an excellent Maiden record, but I remember when that record came out, and still today, a lot of people do not like that record for some reason.
Yes, you're right. A lot of people don't. Yeah.
For one, that tour was, I think, probably Maiden's best tour. I saw him, I believe it was Irvine Meadows on that tour, and I'm sure you were at this one, Brian. I thought the stage show, everything was just Maiden at its peak. I mean, it was just by far, I think their best Maiden concert that I had seen. And I remember I was in right up front, within the first 10 rows when they opened up with Moonchild, and I just felt the combustion of when they did the explosion. And a lot of things I loved about that era. It was great. 1988, and I remember the party that Rod Smallwood threw, and they had this huge giant ice sculpture of Eddie, from the Seventh Son, and everything that was set up around that album, I think was done brilliantly.
I have a great story about that party, by the way. It has nothing to do with Iron Maiden, but it's a hysterical story. If you want, I'll tell it. If
Let's
not,
hear it. Come on. Good stories are always good.
Well, I remember that party because that was the first night that I met the guys in Guns N' Roses.
Same here. Axl was there, I remember.
Axl and Slash were there. I was a huge fan of theirs. And, I was the idiot that never went to go see them. They called me all the time when they were playing these clubs. Like, oh, come see us, come put on our little EP album and all this stuff. And I never went because I had friends that went, and they said, they're a glam band. I go, I don't like glam and all this stuff. So Slash and I started talking. It turns out, we had a lot of friends, mutual friends and stuff, so we started talking. We started drinking. So we were doing, I was doing shot for shot of Jack with Slash, which, as you can imagine, is quite a feat in 1988. But, I had a great time. And I remember towards the end of the night, we're both wasted and sitting on the floor, I think, next to the bar or something. And he finally asked me, he said, how come you never came to see us? I said, well, I thought you guys were a glam band, and I hate glam. He's like, I hate that. We were never a glam band. And then at the very end of the night, the guy who was managing them at that time is this guy, Alan Niven, who used to work at Enigma, which is the people who used to distribute our records. So I knew him because I would go to Enigma once a week and do all my business, and he would always, pull me into his office and talk to me and pick my brain stuff. Really good guy. So at the very end of the party, I'm wasted. He comes up with Axl and says, Axl wants to say hi to you. I was like, oh, cool. So Axl came up and said, I'm Axl Rose and Guns N' Roses. I said, yeah, I know. So he's really nice. He was like, hey, I just wanted to thank you for keeping the scene together in, L.A. in the early days. I was a big fan of that. I said, thanks. I'm a huge fan of your record. Really nice to meet you. And I don't remember this, but all my friends said as soon as he walked away, I basically just fell backwards and passed out.
Excellent. But Maiden always knew how to throw great parties. They've always had fantastic parties throughout the years.
Absolutely. And you know, the other song I like, Can I Play with Madness?
Yeah.
I think that's why a lot of people turned on Maiden, because they came out with this kind of hit radio single sounding song. But I thought it was actually a real clever song and a very well-written song. But a lot of people hated on that.
I think it was a very melodic record, I think, too, you know, just in terms of the melodies and how, I mean, it was heavy, but it was so melodic. But I mean, I love, like, The Evil That Men Do, I love.
Yeah.
Prophecy,
Only the Good Die Young.
Clairvoyant is amazing.
The whole album worked because it was very melodic, but it was uncompromising. This was not Maiden thinking, what's going to get us on the radio, get us in the charts. This was Maiden doing what they wanted to do.
But I think they kind of tried to do that. I don't know if they did it purposely, or was it something that came out with Can I Play with Madness? Because I did promote that as a first single, and maybe never really promoted singles in the States before.
There are reports that made the record, or they were making the record, and there was definitely a lot of pressure from, you know, both the management and the label and everybody to kind of have a follow-up, you know, radio song, because radio was so important at that time. I had heard reports about that. I don't know whether that's true or not, but you definitely heard that those sort of things were going on, and maybe that did turn some people off from that record. But I agree with both of you guys. I think that's a phenomenal, great Maiden record, and, you know, so underlooked at because there's so many people. I don't even know that they don't dislike it, but I think especially the, you know, people who've come later, like all these kids that are going to these Maiden shows, I don't even think they know about the record. They just, for whatever reason, they bought all the big hits, the big classic stuff, but they just never got into this record. I do feel if you do get it, if you're a Maiden fan and you haven't really given it time, it's a great record, and it definitely ranks up there with all that early stuff.
Yeah, very much.
I still think it's the most underrated Maiden album.
Absolutely, you're exactly right.
I agree, and they rarely play this apart from The Evil That Men Do. They don't. I don't think they play any of the songs live anymore.
Well, no, on this last run, they played Moonchild, Evil That Men Do, and The Clairvoyant. It was
all
awesome.
right, rub it in. I missed the last Maiden tour, all right?
Oh, how did you miss that? It was amazing. Yeah, the encore were those three songs.
Oh shit!
Oh no, I take that back. The encore was Moonchild, and I think The Clairvoyant, and they played Can I Play with Madness earlier in the show. That's right. That's the way it went. So, but anyway, it was great.
All right. Well,
Bob, you're out of it. That was one of the greatest
Maiden
shows
Enough.
ever. All right, sorry.
All right. 1990, No Prayer for the Dying. You want to start that one off there, Malcolm?
I'll let Brian go first. I really don't like that record at all. For me, that and Fear of the Dark one. Sorry, what are you doing? I think they'd lost it by then. And they really the songwriting wasn't up to much. The production wasn't up to much. The musicianship was lazy. For me, it was really the beginning of a very bad era for Maiden.
Yeah, I concur with Malcolm a lot there. It's funny, I can't remember how I got a copy of the record a little early, but I had a cassette, of course, back then. Had a copy of it. I listened to it. I wasn't really into it. And I think the next day I was seeing Lars for whatever reason. So we were, you know, I played him a couple of the tracks, and we made jokes about that record for quite a long time afterwards. Because, yeah, it was, you know, they had just gone from being such a great band and just kind of fell off the face of the earth. But, you know, Adrian Smith leaving, I guess, had a lot to do with that happening. It's funny because I actually was lucky enough to go out to dinner with him. When he did his solo record, one of my friends was promoting it, and he called me up one day and said, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" I said, nothing really. He said, "You want to go have dinner with Adrian Smith?" I'm like, "Where?" So we went, and he was, you know, super, super cool, and you know, I talked to him quite a bit. And I said, so, you know, finally after a while, I was like, "So why did you leave Maine?" He said, "You know, I heard the demos and the way what we were writing and where it was going, and that was one of the things that really made me go, because it just, you know, I guess he even felt that the quality of the songs were just not there."
I think this is where Steve Harris's stubbornness started to be detrimental to the band rather than a positive force. And even the cover is just lazy. And I mean, I felt sorry for poor old Yannick Ayres. Here he comes into a big band like that, and suddenly being thrust into an era when things really weren't that great. And what Maiden missed when Maiden left was his songwriting ability as well.
Yeah,
very good songwriter.
He actually co-wrote one of the songs, "Hooks in You," which I don't even really recall. Did Yannick play on the record, or was it all Dave Murray that did the guitars on it?
Yannick played in it as far as I'm aware.
Oh, he did? Okay.
I believe he did.
And the
But of
other
course-
thing that bugged me is, obviously Bruce had done his first solo record, The Tattooed Millionaire, and he had that song "Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter."
Yes.
And then Maiden redid that, which I thought was stupid because the original version was 10 times better.
Absolutely.
Well, I think it clearly seems to me that they were just burnt out from all the touring and all the exposure and all everything else, and they just didn't. They probably took a lot of time off after the last tour, and it felt like they just kind of threw this together really quickly. And if we talked about the Seventh Son and Somewhere Time where Adrian Smith was writing a lot of this stuff too, and he's gone now. So they just seem to seem like a Rush record. Although they do have a song on there called Fate's Warning, which of course is the name of one of the
great
underground metal bands of all
Another
time.
Metal Blade influence. There you go. But I
had to
agree
get my
with you,
plug in
Malcolm.
there.
I think this probably was a starting with, Bruce Dickinson wanting to leave the band too, or, being frustrated with Steve at the time, because it seems like at this point he really took over not only the songwriting.
Production.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was a mistake, a huge mistake,
Yeah,
because
it
the
wasn't very
production is
good
woeful.
produced, right?
It's kind of like these bands. This is just the way almost every single band's career goes. You'll have whatever the first 5 or 6 records of every major important band's career is always really great, and after that there's always a lull. You just naturally, because of the way the business is and the way you have to tour and the pressures, and you run out of ideas, and when you have a lot of money and you're successful, you're not as angst-ridden as you were before, and all these things come into play, and that's certainly both this and the Fall and Fear to the Dark. I kind of put in that category, I think, and I think you're right. Where at some point Bruce just probably figured that this stuff isn't any good. I'm out here.
Yeah. Well, plus, like you said, they did one of their hugest tours at that time, and I'm sure they were just burnt out. And Bruce did his solo record there. Adrian left. They could have taken like a couple years off, and come back fresh and put out a killer record. I think because they obviously still had it in.
But you couldn't do that back then because you had the machine rolling, and you had you're employing 200 people, and you have to go on the road because your crew and everybody else has to work, and this happens all the time. And this is really what led to so many problems with so many guys in bands, whether it's addiction problems or just being burnt out. Because all of a sudden it's not just the 5 guys in the band. When you're at that level, you're employing 250 people that are relying on you to go out and work. It's like it's even Slayer now. With Tom being out, like the road crew are in trouble. I mean, you have so many people on the road that you're responsible for. It's like you just have to keep going. You have to keep touring. You have to keep putting out records because you've got to, feed the beast. And sometimes, you just physically don't have the time or effort to have the inspiration to really make good music either.
But you're right, Brian. The thing is, had they taken that time off, maybe things would have been different. But unfortunately, the reality was they could not, because they had their momentum and everything was locked in. They had a timetable, and there was a financial responsibility. That is the reality of being as huge as Maiden were at the time and are now. But things obviously are a little bit different now to the way they were back then. But yeah, they had to keep on going.
I'm guessing that everybody's thought process is the same on Fear of the Dark as it is on. Although I will say 2 things about Fear of the Dark. Number one, there's one song that I love on that record. There's nothing that I like on No Prayer for the Dying. But there is one song. I do love that song, Judas Be My Guide. I don't know why, but I just love that song. I think it's a really
I think the title track, Fear of the Dark, is a great song.
Yeah, I think the title track, Fear of the Dark, is really good, actually.
Especially live, it goes over very well.
Yeah, it's live is when it suddenly makes sense.
There's a funny thing about Fear of the Dark, because I remember when I listened to the record, I wasn't really into it, but I did love that one song, Judas Be My Guide. I really didn't like Fear of the Dark, the song, very much. And I kind of, after, I think I only saw them once on that tour, and then I didn't see them at all afterwards until Bruce got back in the band. And they started playing that song, and I was like, it's actually not a bad song, I guess. At first I thought it was one of the Blaze Bailey songs they had redone, because I couldn't remember what song is this. And then I was, oh, that's right. Fear the Dark.
And it's
not a bad song.
Pretty astonishing that Yannick had just joined on the previous record, and he's already writing 5 or co-writing 5 of the songs on Fear of the Dark. And
as much as I hate him on stage and his stage presence, he does write good songs.
Yeah, he does. This strikes me too. I'm looking at the tracks here, and none of them really come to mind. And I see there's 12 songs, and you could really see that this is when the CD age came into play. Whereas, previous Maiden records, at least previous to like Seventh Son, it was only, 8 songs on a record, and they were all brilliant songs and memorable songs. Here we got 12 songs. I only recall 2 or 3 of them, It was the age of, there was a lot of filler material where bands felt, okay, we're doing CDs now. We got to add 4 or 5 extra songs.
Oh, I know. It's sort of, we got 60, 70 minutes. Let's fill up 60 or 70 minutes. Yeah. Whatever it takes. It's quantity, not quality.
Yeah.
It was disappointing, and it really undermined what an album should be, which is quality from beginning to end. So it flows and makes you want to hear. The way that Maiden did in their great days in the 80s. You wanted to hear everything on the record. You didn't want to skip.
And that was also, I think a lot of that too is just the time period of when those records came out. I mean, that was the beginning of grunge, and kind of metal had become this big bloated, stupid thing with all these horrible hair metal bands and radio, and just the climate for everything was really bad. So it just wasn't a really good time period for anybody to put out a really good record. But I do have to make one more analogy here. I found it interesting that the record before that, a song called Fate's Warning, and then on this record they had a song called The Apparition, which is a very famous Fate's Warning song, by the way. So anyway.
The Metal Blades influence once again.
Subconsciously, Steve Harris is being influenced.
Apparently so.
Now, was this actually their first album they did on Epic?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it was, and I'm wondering if that might have had an effect too. Although, Maiden records in America never sold huge,
No, they didn't.
Yeah, for a band that's selling out arenas and as big as they are. That was a great thing about Maiden, but you look at them, they never had the radio play. Most of their songs, even their most popular songs, were over 5 minutes long, so they never did cater. They were always a live band, again, which I always respected about, Steve Harris's stubbornness.
Well, that's true, but they did get an awful lot of play on MTV. I mean, Flight of Icarus and,
in
some
the
of
early
those
days,
songs got a lot of play on MTV, too. So some of those records were pretty big. But, they weren't, probably selling as many records as other bands that could, sell out 4 nights at Long Beach Arena,
Right.
And they were, doing 1 million copies per album in America, something like that?
Yeah, some of them 800,000-900,000, I think.
Yeah, so you're talking about, you compare it to the sales of others, it's nothing. Yeah. But, of course, you're on the road. They were huge, bigger than almost anybody.
Absolutely.
In England, of course, in the UK, they remained on EMI. It was only in North America where they switched to Epic.
Hey, Malcolm, they never really had here they had a fairly significant drop. Seventh Son was a lot less sales, less chart positions and those things. But they never really had that drop in the UK, did they? Not
to the same extent. I mean, into the Blaze Bayley era, yes, they did a little bit. But no, they never really dropped that much. They still had such a strong following that they were... I mean, Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter was the #1 single here, incredibly.
The Maiden version?
It's their only #1 single.
Really?
Yeah, so there was still that commitment to Maiden, certainly in those days. And even in the Fear of the Dark, No Prayer for the Dying era, they still were a very strong live pull. And, of course, they did Donington around that time, headlining for the second time.
Wow.
Monsters of Rock. So they were still a very big live draw in the UK and in Europe.
Yeah, and South America, probably everywhere except the U.S.
Well, I don't think, they didn't play South America for a long time. They didn't play there because, when they just went back and did the whole Flight 666 thing, a lot of those places they played on that tour, they hadn't been there for like 20 years. Wow. So it was
maybe ever at all.
I think in the 90s they pretty much concentrated just on Europe, really, and they would come over and do, because I remember they were doing less and less touring here, and they were doing a lot more touring in Europe, which is, where they were still huge, and they could play, in huge arenas in Spain and Portugal and everywhere. They couldn't really do that here. And I think also at that point, I could be wrong, but I think that the pound to the dollar was in one of those things where it wasn't really a profitable situation for them to come over and play here as much, so they concentrated more on Europe.
Right.
No, I think you're right. And certainly in the Blaze Bayley era, they were concentrating on areas where perhaps they knew just by going there they can get 20,000 people. And a lot of the traditional markets, they were dropping off. And the attendances were certainly diminishing quite fast. And it was even noticeable in the UK that the venues they were playing were smaller and they were doing less nights.
I would say that we should forget the Blaze Bayley era completely.
Right.
I really want to erase that from my brain. I really, as a Maiden fan, I don't believe that it ever happened or it ever existed. I don't know any of those records or anything.
Well,
so
I think Maiden have erased it from their brain.
That you can.
Well, let's put it this way. I think Maiden have erased it from their brain. Because when compilations come out, do they ever put anything on
they
the Blaze Bayley?
used to do the Klansmen every so often with Bruce
afterwards. Yeah, and it's a very good song when done by Bruce and done live.
Right.
It is a really good song.
I'll say one point on those two records, and this is, going back to what we said about the changing of the vocalists and all that. Of course, Blaze Bayley got so much flack for that, but the albums sucked. And the thing that I was really disappointed with Steve Harris is, when Bruce Dickinson joined, they adapted to the sound of Bruce's voice. When Bruce does the Paul Di'Anno stuff, it's not near as good as the Paul Di'Anno stuff.
No.
Obviously, Paul Di'Anno can't sing the Bruce Maiden era stuff.
No.
Look, because Blaze Bayley's not a bad singer, but he's not Bruce Dickinson. He can't do the Bruce Dickinson voice,
Well, he was not the right guy at all.
He was definitely not the guy. I think it was more of an image. He kind of looked like Bruce, same height, same haircut, same,
you know what? I still believe, and Steve Harris will probably deny this, one of the reasons why they went for Blaze was because Steve and Bruce didn't get on really well. Steve was irritated that Bruce quit, and he said, you know what? Anybody can replace you. I'm going to get him in because, A, he's been on tour with us. B, he's English, and that was important to Steve. And C, he looks like you, and I know it's going to bug the hell out of you, Bruce.
And
I'm still convinced it was in his mind.
Or football, as
well, I think what happens with a lot of these bands, look, singers are, I'm trying to think of the word that I should use this to be nice. They're very high maintenance. And singers, I deal with a million bands all the time, all of us do. And, you kind of know that there's always, especially, musician to singer, is always that there's a bit of tension there. And it's sooner or later, you're going to have a bit of that happening. So, and then the natural thing that so many of these bands did, Van Halen did it, Motley Crue did it. So many of these bands, they just will go out and get somebody that almost doesn't care. They almost don't care what they sound like. It's just, okay, he's a great guy. He's fun to hang out with. If I got to go on the road for 5 months, I like being with this guy. He's a cool guy to hang out with. And they just kind of put aside that, we'll tell him what he can do and it'll work. And it just doesn't work. You got to have, whether the personality is in there is right. And sometimes having a personality in there that is opposite of you, that doesn't get along with you, also fuels your creative fire a little bit too. True.
So few big bands have managed to replace a singer. I mean, obviously AC/DC, Bon died, they got Brian in, but that was a different circumstance. Sabbath did it with Ozzy and Ronnie, right. But apart from that, well, has anybody else really ever done it? I mean, Priest waited a long time to find Ripper Owens, who was a great frontman, but even then the shadow of the spectre of Halford was never erased. And I think Maiden rushed into this anyway. And given some of the people who actually auditioned for them, I'm amazed they went for Blaze. There were so many better people out there. I think a lot of it was Steve thinking, well, you know what, fuck you, Bruce. You're not that important to us. And I'm going to get this guy because he looks like you and you're going to be annoyed by that. And Wolfsbane had been on tour with Maiden just before that. And Blaze was really good fronting Wolfsbane in clubs. But he was way out of his depth. And one of the things that always amuses me is that just before Blaze was announced, there was a rumor Blaze was going to come in, and I saw Nico and Yannick one night in a club, and they laughed at the idea that Blaze was going to be in Maiden. 48 hours later, he was in Maiden. Now, you tell me whose decision that was.
Yeah.
Because Nico and Yannick clearly weren't committed to it. I doubt very much whether Dave Murray was ever consulted particularly. Comes down to one man. I think Steve Harris just decided he's in, and that's it. And you knew it was going wrong just after he joined, because the whole band, Maiden, came out to see a Scottish band called Gun playing at the Borderline. And it was all pals together. We're in this together. We're a gang. And it was very much overly emphasizing the fact that Blaze was part. It's a band now. It's a unit. And then Blaze got drunk and made a fool of himself. I remember Steve Harris walking out, shaking his head. And he knew then the problem was actually really going to hit the wall. And it did.
Yeah, it's hard to replace a front man. It's so hard to do that. And if you don't have, and it's very difficult to find. There aren't that many great frontmen out there. So you have a really small pool, and then you got to find somebody that you like, and all these other things. It's hard to do that. Clearly they didn't figure that out. Hey, before Malcolm leaves, I do have to say that I'll probably get myself in a lot of trouble for saying this, but Classic Rock Magazine is the best printed magazine in the world.
That's fair enough. I'll pass that on.
All right, that does end part 2 of the Iron Maiden discussion. Many thanks to my guest, Brian Slagel from Metal Blade Records, and of course, Malcolm Dome from Classic Rock Magazine and Total Rock Radio. We'll be posting up part 3. That's right. I did say part 3 of the Iron Maiden episode real soon. So be looking out for that. Of course, you can always check here at the official Shockwave Skull Sessions website. That is roadrunnerrecords.com/skull sessions. You can also check out the Shockwave Skull Sessions on many podcast directories, including iTunes. Just go to the iTunes store and type in Shockwaves, and both the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast and the Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast, my sister podcast, will pop up. So be sure to subscribe to both. You can also check out the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on the Classic Metal Show at theclassicmetalshow.com. And be sure to send in those comments at shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. That is my personal email. I do read and answer all emails sent. So with that said, man, we'll see you next time. Thanks for checking out the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.